Sorry about that. Maybe that'll work a little bit better. Can you hear us now? Hopefully that'll.
Does it
Oh
work?
my. We had a slight little fraggo here. Hopefully the audio is working great right now. Okay, great. It was a button that I didn't push. Sorry about that. So let me kind of go back and talk about this disclaimer. Uh, so thank you everybody for joining us. I apologize for the little mishap of the audio. I try to make this look as streamlined as possible, but I'm still getting used to it. But anyhow, before we start talking about trauma, we want to talk in the little bit of the disclaimer that we have for every stream, and that's to remind everyone here that the side streams are psychoeducational in nature, and they're not intended to be any kind of a counseling services, just because we cannot provide any kind of confidentiality. With that being said, we invite anyone and everyone to type in their comments in the chat channel, give us your views, let us know what your thoughts are on the topic, because that's what matters the most. We're doing this because we want to help you understand the material better. And this stream is not meant for just, psychologists and social workers. This is here for everybody. And we want to make sure that we are delivering the message in a way that you all understand. And again, that's the reason why we open it up for questions, and we want to make sure that you understand where we're going. So again, going back to talking about trauma, this is leading into our next topic, and that's going to be about PTSD. PTSD has been talked about quite a few times in our streams, so we figured this was the good time to introduce what can cause PTSD, and that's trauma. We're going to cover the different kinds of it, how it can influence you, and we're going to make sure that we do our very best to help answer any kind of questions or concerns you have about that. So I think I've done a lot of talking right now, kind of doubling back on what I missed. Hannah, you want to take it for what would you like to start with?
Well, I want to also just add that one of the reasons that we're also going to not be fielding like a lot of questions. Like if you say something in our chat that is of private nature, we're not going to read it out. Typically, we try to read things out so that the people who are maybe watching later on that don't have the video up, or for whatever reason they're
Mm-hmm.
not able to see what's going on in chat, they are able to still kind of know what the direction the conversation is going. However, if the conversation is in personal type of nature, we're not going to say that out loud. One of the reasons for that is because, so don't get offended if you write something and you're like, hey, why aren't you reading mine? We are going to be turning a lot of these into podcasts in the later time, as soon as I get around to doing that, to be honest. And that way, when we're dealing with things that we're not having that sort of stuff just being out all the
Right.
time for everybody to have access to. Because again, this is one of those situations where we want to make sure it's about your privacy.
Yep.
Yes, it's about protecting us as professionals because we have to adhere to different state and federal laws working in mental health. But this is mostly for you to make
Mm-hmm.
sure that whatever you're going through is being kept private. Um, one thing that I did miss in my introduction, which I'm going to say now because it's very important, is that so my degree background is I have a master's degree in counseling with an emphasis in trauma and crisis. So this topic is something, as I said earlier, something that is very passionate for me. It is something that is very important of a topic. It's not only something I deal with frequently, and when I was dealing with clinical, it's something that I have written numerous essays for my schooling. It's something that I value above everything. In fact, the reason I got into doing the mental health profession in the first place was actually because of my desire to help people who have experienced trauma, because it is one of those things that almost all of the reasons that we experience trauma are things that are actually very taboo.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
people don't like to talk about combat and what that does to somebody. Nobody likes to talk about war and disaster zones. Nobody likes to talk about abuse. Nobody wants to talk about violent crimes or rape or any of these other sorts of things that we see happening in our world, but we just kind of shut ourselves off to it because it's hard.
Right.
It's not fun topics. We don't like to talk about them. they're not comfortable, they're not happy, they typically do not have a positive outcome.
Mm-hmm.
Very few of these outcome or very few of these situations turn around and saying, I'm so happy that my house burned down in a fire. That was just fantastic. It was,
Yeah.
I mean, it was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
Very few people say, wow, I'm so happy that I was sexually abused as a child. These are not things that you hear. And that is why it's taboo. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to be sad. We don't want to deal with it. And so a lot of times trauma is ignored,
Yeah.
just because it's uncomfortable.
Yep.
And so those are some of the things we're actually going to be talking about today, is going over just some of those different areas of what trauma is, and why they're traumatic. And so the first thing I want to do is, and this is something that I hear a lot, people misusing trauma. Oh, I've
Mm-hmm.
got PTSD from when the cat made a loud noise. Well, that's not PTSD. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we're defining what trauma is. Trauma, and Matt, you can definitely jump in
Yes.
with this, but when I was doing my research, one of the things that we've learned about trauma is that trauma is based on usually a perceived or a very real threat of danger.
Mm-hmm.
So this is usually a very real or perceived threat of death or severe bodily harm. And it is also, there's a second part that most people, even clinicians, don't usually talk about, is it is when it also exceeds our level of coping.
Yeah.
Now, what that means, because again, we are an educational show and we're going to try to make this topic fun. Um, Yay.
Yeah.
But if we can't make it fun, we're going to at least make sure to make it easily accessible to everybody so that even somebody who has never heard of these topics can
Mm-hmm.
understand it. So when we're talking about exceeds our ability to cope or our level of coping, when you're a child, you can't just, oh, my parents are fighting, I can just leave the house. That's not something you can cope with. You can't just walk out
Yeah.
and say, I'm going to go do something else so I don't witness this experience. So maybe as an adult, seeing your parents, fight
Mm-hmm.
or get violent with each other, or experiencing some sort of violence in that respect, or having maybe getting into a fight in a bar, which you shouldn't be doing, obviously.
Yeah.
But those sorts of things are not necessarily going to cause trauma. However, witnessing those things as a child, because we are as children not able to cope with those sorts of situations, that is what we mean by exceeds our ability to cope.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the same thing as if you're talking about a natural disaster. Well, if it's a natural disaster and you have insurance, you didn't really lose anything, you were at work when the whatever the disaster hit, you didn't experience it directly, maybe that's not going to be something that's going to traumatize you, versus if it's something that was your whole life. Now everything is gone, you were at home when it happened, you had to now escape.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to then be a different level of coping you're going to have to experience.
Um,
So those are the two big things. Is
yeah.
it has to be that it's a real or perceived threat, and it has to be exceeds your ability to cope. And I'm sorry, Matt, continue.
No, that's all right. Mr. Luke, thank you for hanging out with us today. They have a really good thought. This is, but it's also because of the society in general. You're expected to work properly and get yourself together. So,
Oh yeah.
that's you nailed it right there. We in the Western side of the world, we have a very I would say right now it's in flux, but a kind of an unhealthy way of looking at
Hmm.
trauma as far as addressing it and talking about it. Some families, they'll just kind of sweep it under the rug, thinking that it's done. Let's not think about it. Let's not talk about it. And more importantly, let's not even give ourselves the time to process what happened. And it really kind of minimizes the person who is affected. And that's just one area of concern when we are expected to just kind of, as they say in the military, suck it up and press on. You just aren't allowing yourself the time needed in order to work through what just happened. And one thing, I want to bring up something because we were kind of talking about the various types of way trauma can present itself. Here's something that's really interesting, and this happened on Friday. Okay, and I don't know if anybody knew anyone here saw this, but um, back in Santa Rosa, that's where I used to live for a couple of years. My two kids are in high school right now, and they were going to Santa Rosa High. Well, on Friday, they had the place on lockdown. They had everybody stuck in the gym. People were evacuating the school and being picked up by their family members because there was a freshman there with a handgun. All right,
Mhm.
and so the first thing that came to mind is this is trauma.
Mhm.
This could be traumatic for a lot of these kids because there is a perceived threat. There could be serious bodily harm or death, and and they something that they added new in the DSM. It's not doesn't have to necessarily be against you, but against
Mhm.
people that are close to you. So like a close
Mhm.
friend or a family member, and that was the first thing that came to my mind. Thankfully, what it turned out to be was this kid who was trying to protect himself, not an excuse to bring a handgun by any means to a campus. I don't get that part, but in my mind, I was just thinking about trauma, trauma, trauma. You know, and
Mhm.
I think after what you were just saying, explaining to the group, that I thought that was an appropriate time to jump in there and talk about that, and
Well,
because
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah, and of course, I'm kind of like the representative for the veteran slash military side. Hannah, you've had a tremendous amount of experience professionally in that realm when it comes to the younger folks. I've had to work as a clinician at the vet centers where basically everybody that I came to see had some sort of traumatic event because the vet centers only saw war veterans and then sexual assault survivors, and
Mhm.
they all have a story to tell, and it's not all guns a blazing and stuff like that. And I say all this because you're right. Everyone has a different level of coping with traumatic events.
Mhm.
Everybody, one person can be getting shot at and they're completely traumatized from it, while another person they're like, okay, that's just the way it is. I'm in a war zone. It's different for everyone. And I'll kind of
Mhm.
wrap up this little part with a saying. A friend and fellow professional back at the vet centers I used to work at, she said, you can get 5 people, put them all in a room, and expose them to the same context, the same scenario, or what have you, and they'll all have 5 different experiences because they're all different people. So what could be traumatizing for one person is just okay for whatever it is for another person, and so that's why we can't minimize. That's the other
Yeah.
point and component to this. We can't minimize what that person's feeling because it's different for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. I also have a very similar story that actually ties into yours as well with your children. But I actually worked in a high school
Oh,
for several years,
yes.
and at first I worked in a I was the head of a tutoring department at the high school that I worked, and then later on I actually worked in a clinical setting that was directly on the campus of a high school, and so we were frequently dealing with having to, well, what's going to happen if we have a lockdown, what's going to
Mm-hmm.
happen if we have a situation. And we actually, unfortunately, I was involved in I want to say 2 or 3. What's sad is I cannot actually remember if it was 2 or 3 different situations between the two different schools. One was a threat in the community, two that were threats on campus.
Wow.
Neither ended up being anything serious. One
Good.
was gang related,
Mm-hmm.
and so there was no like active shooter. The other one ended up actually being an airsoft gun, and so did not actually pose a threat. But they both ended up having a lockdown. And what people don't realize is when you're in a situation like that, is that when they come through and they start clearing classrooms, you end up actually having the police force or SWAT or whoever is in charge of that.
Yeah.
They have a master set of keys. They open the door and they full out like break down that door and come in with their guns raised,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they don't know what they're going to encounter. And I mean, I can't blame them. They don't have time to be nice about it.
Right.
But unfortunately, that can be very upsetting for people who are in
Absolutely.
that situation. And one of the teachers at one of the schools that I worked in, she actually ended up not being able to do her job after that. she ended up having to quit because of PTSD.
Mm.
And it was pretty severe. And I heard so many of the other, and I'm not going to call out the school on this, that I was at because I don't feel that'd be right. But there were a bunch of other the teachers that were talking bad about her, about how she's so weak and so pathetic.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but all it is that, her perceived threat in that moment and her ability to cope with that situation. I knew this teacher, and she literally would have laid down her life for any one of those kids in her classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know her level of commitment. So for a situation like that to happen, like you're saying, you can put 5 people in a situation and they're all going to have a different response to it. This
Yeah.
particular teacher, her response was, I really thought I was going to die because I would have died for them. Some of these other
Mm-hmm.
teachers didn't necessarily have, I'm not going to say they didn't have the same level of commitment. I can almost guarantee they all did. But in that moment, that's not what was going through their heads. Their heads were still going, is it really a threat?
Mm-hmm.
There was even a teacher that continued to conduct a test thinking that
Oh,
it wasn't a big
jeez.
deal.
Oh my gosh.
That teacher was also let go. Um,
Okay.
so yeah, so this is what I mean by your perceived level of
Yeah.
threat, your level of ability to
Mm-hmm.
cope. A bunch of different teachers, same situation, but this one teacher, the way that she experienced that day
Mm-hmm.
left her very traumatized. Where and I'm not gonna lie, I ended up in a classroom not knowing it by myself, not knowing if it was a threat or not.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just like locked down in the class going,
What the hell?
did I not get informed of a lockdown drill? And so it was a pretty intense thing. But I didn't experience PTSD from it. I have to say, when I went to my other job, there was definitely the moment of when I look around in a different high school setting, I always kind of know, where are the locks, where are the keys, where's
Mm-hmm.
the best place to shelter. I do think about that, having experienced it, but I don't feel that I can't work in that environment because of it.
Let's jump in here, Luke. We got again. I appreciate your input and your thoughts. He said, but we can offer help and teach what to do, and that others, relatives should not look away like it is often today. Exactly right. And
Absolutely.
it starts with one person, and it starts with
Mhm.
you, and spreading that really positive look or outlook when it comes to trauma. It's hard to talk about. It's hard to digest. But the more we talk about it and normalize, and that's hard to do. Normalize trauma. It almost sounds like a counter or oxymoron. But if we normalize trauma, where a person can feel comfortable with saying, I felt like I was threatened, or I felt like I was going to die, and not have to worry about shame, judgment, minimizing. I think that's the path that's going to really help our society
Abs-
truly get through these stigmas of mental health, and of course trauma. Um, and it's interesting because we talk about schools and stuff like that. We've I just think about one word that always comes to mind, and they talk about, at least in the journals that I've read, is resiliency. Resiliency
Yes.
is just basically another way of how do we, again, cope with situations. And a lot of the veterans, that I had seen on the day, they're like, I just don't understand why this one particular event really got to me. This one particular event they characterize as being traumatic. And I said, look, man, I said, there's really a lot of ways to look at this. It has nothing to do with being weak or anything like that. No, not at all. I says, you got to recognize or realize that here in America, for the most part, and obviously there's exceptions to the rules, I know I can go outside of my house right now, walk down the street, and I don't have to worry about a roadside bomb. Or I don't have to worry
Mhm.
about some sniper taking pop shots at me. And so we, as in our society, and I'm only expressing this in a general term, but obviously there's exceptions. We live in a very fairly safe environment. And although a lot of people would argue that that's starting to change, in the most part, it is still a very safe environment compared to a place like Iraq or
Oh, yeah,
Afghanistan
absolutely.
or any of the other places that are war torn. And so I tell that veteran who's just trying to wrap their mind around this and saying, look, we're used to being safe. We're used to being protected to a certain extent. And you're taken from that safe environment of good old USA, and you're thrown into an environment where you're seeing people trying to kill you. You're seeing explosions. You're seeing roadside bombs. That is not normal. And I kind of ended up with
Mhm.
saying something like, and this is what we'll talk about more next session. Uh,
Mhm.
PTSD is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, and for
Oh,
many of us,
absolutely. Thank you
yeah,
for saying that.
yeah, and so this is the PTSD is a coping mechanism. So the trauma is what triggers that.
Yeah.
So you said, Hannah, that when it came to children, how I know a little bit. Obviously, I know that depending on the age of the child, they will not be able to verbalize the trauma or their experiences, but more so do it through drawings and stuff like that, or playing out the situation. What has been your experience when you see the younger youth or youth in general when they're experience or reflecting on it?
So here's the situation. I actually never worked with anything under the younger than adolescent. So
Okay.
I believe the youngest client I've ever worked with was about 11 or 12 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So I've never done full child therapy. However, I've gone through a lot of the classes
Mm-hmm.
because of specifically when you're doing when you're adding like an emphasis to your degree. I had to take an additional 12 units of trauma training. So there was additional 4 classes, like an entire semester's worth of full load of just classes dedicated to different trauma. And so we had to do specifically with abuse,
Mm-hmm.
as well as disaster zones were 2 of the big areas we had to do, as well as then like triage. So technically, I'm trained to handle a situation like if we were to have a disaster such as maybe 9/11. I'm actually trained to be able to be on the ground floor of
Cool.
that to do on-site crisis management in an emergency like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just based on the schooling I have. And so when you're dealing with children oftentimes it's exactly like you said. Oftentimes they'll play different. They
Mm-hmm.
will there'll be art that they do. And so most of the training I have is how to spot it.
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm not specifically trained as an art therapist, and I commend those wonderful people who totally are because they're amazing. But there are forms of art therapy and play therapy that is very useful for children, no matter what you're starting to treat. But with trauma, it can be very important because, like you said, they're not able to verbalize.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing we need to hit with trauma. And one of the reasons why I think it's so important that we talk about trauma now
Yeah.
and educate people is because one of the big things about experiencing trauma is actually if you are able to process that trauma
Mm-hmm.
sooner rather than later, you have a less of a chance. I don't say you have no chance, but you have less of a chance of developing things like PTSD.
Yep. Yep.
The issue with children, and I'm seeing we
Yeah, we
do
got a
have a
really good,
comment.
another good comment from Luke. Luke, you
Yeah.
you are awesome. You're on a roll today. I'll go ahead and read it out. I mean, it could be every event. It can be a car crash, a robbery, or other incidents. And because it can be every little thing, everything that maybe happen, it should be very okay to talk about it. Exactly right. And Luke, you're nailing a very specific point. We might not have put enough time in. And let me just say, absolutely, car crashes. Hannah already talked about it. Natural disasters, robberies, things like that. That's trauma. Okay, depending on your circumstances, that is trauma. We absolutely. It's not just guns, war, and shootings, but there's so many different ways you can be exposed to traumatic experiences.
Yeah, so because of that, I think what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to rewind for a second because I have a list.
Oh,
I
nice.
actually made a list of all of the different areas I want to start talking about. So let's just do that. Let's just do that. We're gonna just I want to just start off with let's just actually talk about some different things. Specifically, maybe let's talk about um, violent crimes and different things you experience, like you mentioned, the car crashes.
Sounds good.
So let's stick to that because those are things that are I don't want to say occurring every day, but unfortunately they are occurring every day. So let's just start with that. Let's start with the smaller stuff, as far as like they're more isolated events.
Mm-hmm.
Smaller, not as far as the magnitude of what you are dealing with them, but they're more isolated. So specifically, violent crimes, which in this situation we're going to be talking about, specifically rape
Mm-hmm.
or being threatened or assaulted, and then situations like when we're dealing with being involved in a traumatic one-time event such as a car accident, or you're really the one person that's being affected.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything you would like to weigh on that, Matt?
Sure. Um, it's and I'm going back to my clinical experiences. Um, not every client, not every veteran that I had seen not that didn't their traumatic event did not happen on the battlefield. Okay, and some of it
Mhm.
was through accidents that happened that they witnessed. One that calls to mind involved a terrible accident with someone that was in their unit where they eventually died from the accident. And so, um, again, it goes back to that one point where it doesn't have to be necessarily to you, but to someone who's close to you, like a friend or a family member. And these types of isolated events, they we and in society, especially when it comes to sexual assault, there is still a very, as far as I'm concerned, a very ass backwards way of looking at it in some areas. Obviously, the Me Too movement had sparked a lot of interest or understanding more in terms of what sexual assault is like for the person. And to go back on that is that you always hear those very very I'm just going to say it, ignorant statements about how people, how, well, they shouldn't have dressed that way, or they were giving off the wrong signals, or something even just as important, is the misconceptions that people have in relationships itself. And I won't get off tangent, but a lot of people think that, and this is part of the trauma, think that when a person is in a relationship with them, that they're obligated to have some intimacy, physical intimacy with them, and to withhold that means you have no right to do that, and they have every right to take that intimacy from you. So, and that's not true. It's a two-way thing. It has to be an accepting thing on both sides, both parties, when it comes to that. And so, you hear stories about spouses who are sexually abused by their husbands. They're like, well, how can that happen? They're married. No, you're misunderstanding that, and that just leads to the stigma of trauma, because we need
Mhm.
to do. And again, that's kind of what we're doing right now, is trying to educate people about it.
Absolutely. Yeah, spousal rape, unfortunately, is a very real thing. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason I wanted to cover this topic first, was specifically dealing with violent crimes, sexual assault, and areas that are more related to that, again, such as like car crashes and different just violent acts that you can be experiencing, is this really touches our first responders. So
Mm-hmm.
anybody that's in a helping field, we're talking about firemen, police officers, EMTs. We're talking about our doctors and our nurses,
Yeah.
especially in emergency care situations, because they are people that are witnessing all of this, and these are people that are experiencing some of these things firsthand. I have a brother-in-law who's a fireman, and some of the stories he has about car crashes he's witnessed and just some of the stuff he's seen,
Mm-hmm.
uh, to many would be incredibly traumatizing.
Yes.
And just as people who have experienced it know that those things, I personally, I actually have an issue with driving. I can't drive. I hate to drive, because I have been involved in many, many, many uh, accidents in my life. And the best way the only way to explain why is with just one sentence is my mom was an alcoholic,
Mm-hmm.
and so I was involved in a lot of car accidents growing up, and so I see danger in all of it, and it's something that I have a very hard time um, dealing with now. I wouldn't say that I have full PTSD though, because as we'll get later, we will start talking about what PTSD is.
Yep.
However, it
Criteria.
was traumatic. Trauma, PTSD, two completely different things. Trauma is an experience, PTSD is a possible repercussion. Not the only repercussion, but a possible repercussion. So the trauma I experienced in this situation did lead to a lot of anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's something that I've had to deal with a lot of just not being able to drive on freeways. And just some of the anxiety that goes with it. So, if that's something that somebody like I can experience just being a person that went through it, we have to think about our helpers out there, our
Yes.
first responders
Yep.
who are on the front lines and literally seeing all of the aftermath of this.
And Luke, I'm gonna get to you in just 1 second, because you're talking about the first responders and the trauma ER wards and stuff like that. There's a movement that's gaining traction out there in social media about the suicide rate of law enforcement and
Yeah.
the fire departments, and it almost seems like, and I hate to say this, but it almost seems like they're going through the same struggle that veterans did about 15 years ago, about helping raise the awareness of the struggles that the first responders are finding out, or excuse me, experiencing, and their suicide rate, and it's starting to grow from what I recall exponentially. So it's important that we take all of it into consideration. I had several clients who were combat veterans, and they went to be in the sheriff's department or the police department, and they had hard time processing sometimes what they were seeing, and so I can totally see how that can affect someone's mental health as a whole, and what could drive them to possibly do what they're doing. And Luke said he kind of had the same experience as you did. He got in a car crash on the highway, and he had a real fear of driving on the highway, and that's very common. It makes sense. Your brain is trying to say, dude or dudette, you literally just got in this big old accident on the highway. Why the hell would you want to go back on there and risk yourself doing that again? And I've got plenty of moments where I've done that in my life too. We're evolving very fast, but forget our human side. And that's it.
That's
Go ahead, Hannah.
I'm just, when he said that, that actually, I put two and two together on some stuff that you were talking about with the issue of our first responders and how they're not being taken care of. And I think that a lot of this actually comes from exactly what he just said, is we're evolving, but we're forgetting our human side.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that a lot of times when you're in a field that's specifically an EMT, a firefighter, a police officer,
Yeah.
the view is, well, but that's what you signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to relate this, and I'm going to do it. Sorry, but it also relates to when we're talking about sexual assault. Well,
Yes.
were they drinking? And I am 100%, I'm totally on the equality side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Men are just as capable of being victims of sexual assault, not just women. So
Right.
I'm not going to use the trope of look what she was wearing, because I think that it's still, we need to talk about things that apply to men too. But it's the same thing of, well, he was flirting, she was flirting.
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
were drinking. You put yourself in that position. I think that's when people start to ignore trauma, is whenever it's a situation. I think there's two things that can happen. This is all going through in my brain right now. I'm like having a revelation. I think the reasons we don't talk about it is, on one side, we have well, you put yourself in that position to be experiencing that trauma. You're a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
You signed up for listening to people's problems all day.
Mm-hmm.
You're a police officer. You signed up for possibly having to take down somebody with your gun. You're an EMT. You signed on for the blood.
Yep.
And because of that, we lose that human side of, well, how are we helping these people process the trauma where they're going through?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's unfortunate is when I talk to the people I know, and this is not the case in all fire stations and all police stations, but unfortunately it is very common for them not even to have a supervisor that comes and says, hey, let's process what you went through. I know that you just witnessed a very deadly crash.
Mm-hmm.
What did you see? Let's talk about it. Which is we're talking about something that's very important to not having a trauma turn into a PTSD
Hmm.
is the process of processing.
Yeah.
We need to process the events, and people aren't there to process even within these jobs because this is what you signed on for. And
Right.
then the second side of things of why we don't talk about trauma is pretty much everything else is the taboo subject.
Yeah.
So either you did it to yourself or it's taboo and it makes us uncomfortable and we don't want to talk about it.
And it also releases that person who says something like that, any kind of involvement in that person's situation. And to me, it seems
Absolutely.
like it's a really quick way to skip out saying that this, that's your problem, not mine. CrossForge, you got a really good question there. I'm going to read it out.
Yeah, well, this is, I've already read it. This is something we're definitely going to be talking about further, just so you know.
Yes, absolutely. But we'll give you the quick dirty on it. Interesting that you mentioned emergency response. I was wondering, can PTSD trigger hallucinatory episodes? Not necessarily flashbacks. Example, Dennis Leary's character in Rescue Me, who starts seeing dead in these horrific scenes talk to him. Okay, so I've never seen that show, so I'm just basing this off of what you're telling me. From what I know and what I know from research and the work that I've done, there is no hallucinatory episodes. There's flashbacks. There are avoidance and stuff like in that type of with PTSD. But in fact, whenever I do or used to do intakes with clients, one of the things we would ask them, we would separate between flashbacks and hallucinations because they're two different things. And so, hallucinations is not a component necessarily of PTSD. In fact, when we look at hallucinations, we tend to look in other avenues as far as what's causing that. I hope that helped you out a little bit. That makes make it even more muddier.
I'm actually going to clarify a little bit just from some experience I've had. I'm just gonna be honest, myself with PTSD. Just so our audience is aware, is I believe both Matt and I have had PTSD that we've not only experienced but we've been treated for. Am I correct?
Yes.
And so, obviously, very different situations. Matt was, I'm not going to talk about what his PTs can choose to talk about his. Mine was actually from childhood abuse. And so, the question you're asking is actually a very interesting thing, is because when we're talking about flashbacks, the reason that it gets confused with it being hallucinations is because when we're talking about PTSD flashbacks, they can be real, they
Yes.
can feel real. You can hear those sounds. You can feel what's going on. You can feel every emotion that you felt in that situation.
Hmm.
A flashback actually is mostly categorized by an actual putting yourself back in to the situation in which you were traumatized. So when I
Hmm.
was working in a clinical setting, I dealt with 95% of my clients were trauma victims. I had everything from clients who had been victims of sex trafficking to child abuse to young adults who had actually come over from the Middle East after their families were killed by ISIS and they witnessed this.
Hmm.
So these are things I saw and I heard. And so it's something that, for instance, coming up on 4th of July, this is again going back for anybody who is joining us now and wasn't here in the beginning. One of the reasons we decided to do trauma was two reasons.
Hmm.
The first reason is actually PTSD Awareness Month. So this is going to
Yep.
be, if you're on our social media, you will be seeing me posting constantly PTSD awareness because this is a huge passion project of mine. And the second reason is because coming up on 4th of July, it is a very, very, very triggering time for our military personnel, as well as, by the way, Memorial Day, which we just had.
Yep.
And every time I saw somebody who said Happy Memorial
Oh
Day,
yeah.
I actually had to stop them or said Thank you, veterans. I had
Yeah.
to stop them and say this isn't about them; these are about the people who died. And you saying that can be really disrespectful
Hmm.
because these people might be experiencing grief of somebody they lost in
That
combat.
that is absolutely right.
And so you can't be going around saying thank you for your service because that can be triggering itself. Why am I here and they're not?
Hmm.
You're starting to deal with survivor's guilt. So we decided to take kind of this position. I hope I'm not triggering anybody. I'm gonna be frank and honest about stuff. That's what the stream is about. So I apologize. That's what Stack Up is here for. If you do need support, because
Yep.
anything we are talking about becomes triggering for you, I do highly recommend you head over to our Discord for Stack Up, and there's people usually available. I've never seen anybody not available
Right.
to talk to you and help process whatever you're dealing with in that moment. So that's my disclaimer. Um, but coming into 4th of July, fireworks.
Mm-hmm.
Fireworks can sound very much like gunshots,
Mm-hmm.
and they can sound like bombs, and there are
Yes.
explosions. Let's just be honest. Fireworks are literally explosions.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be very traumatizing for somebody who has ever experienced a combat zone. Um, and so when you're dealing with a flashback, especially a flashback that is triggered by something like that, you can have people literally feel like they are back on the combat field.
Yep.
So no, it is not a classic hallucination, but it can be such a vivid flashback that it can feel like a hallucination
Mm-hmm.
because it is something that they've experienced. Now, the way that we usually would differentiate those two, because they can feel the exact same. You can have a hallucination feel just as real as a flashback. But here's the difference: hallucination, they've never experienced before.
Yeah.
A flashback is usually a memory of something they've actually experienced.
Yes.
And so that's where you're getting the difference between a hallucination and a flashback, and why they're different. One's a memory, one is something that is triggering your brain that you have never experienced before, and you are seeing a lion in your living room. You've never experienced a lion in your living room, I'm assuming, but you're seeing a lion. That's a hallucination.
Mm-hmm.
However, experiencing a fear in a flashback of a combat related situation, when you have actually experienced that, that's a flashback.
It looks like Luke and
So,
Cross has kind of weighed in some more. Luke's talking about how the folks there in Germany, the elderly population, get really frightened by the
mhm.
fireworks because of World War II. And
Oh,
then
absolutely.
Crossforge is talking about how his grand uncle was on Omaha Beach, and the standing rule for their family was no fireworks, and that makes sense.
Mhm. I don't
Again,
do fireworks.
yeah, I mean, at my house, we don't have fireworks. My PTSD is combat related, and I've gotten better of it over the time. But my startle response was just really quick whenever I would hear those explosions, and depending on where I was living at the time, like if fireworks was legal, it was just crazy, and it was very very challenging. Night for me as well, and I'm sure for a lot of folks who have the same experience.
Absolutely. So I think that we've covered
Yeah.
kind of where first responders. I think we'll be doing another segment later on down the line that is very specifically geared towards vicarious trauma, secondhand trauma, that sort of thing. But that can be a segment in itself. So we're going to leave right now our situations such as car crashes, sexual assaults, violent crimes. We're going to kind of leave that right now. And because it seems to be brought up a lot, I do want to make sure we are already talking about combat. So I want to just kind of shift our focus, and we're going to talk about combat and things like disaster zones and natural disasters. The reason I'm putting these in a different sort of category is because before they were more isolated. It happens to one person, it's just you. You're the one experiencing this individually. When we're talking about combat zones, we're talking about disaster zones, we're talking about natural disasters. We are talking about a larger reaching. And by the way, this is how my previous classes also split things up. So I'm using all of my knowledge. Thank you, school.
Yes.
And I'm kind of compartmentalizing this into a different area. So I know Matt obviously has a lot more experience in combat, even though it is a passion of mine to help veterans. I'm going to let him really kind of talk about it. We've already talked about flashbacks, which was one thing that we were going to cover, so we don't need to cover that now. But let's talk about combat disaster zones and natural disasters.
Sounds good. Now, where to start with combat? It's really really interesting. I've researched it in a historical, way, and I've also looked at it from the mental health perspective of combat in general. And was really interesting, and we're definitely going to talk about this more in depth in our next side stream. Is just how, even though, and I've said this to my groups that I've held. I had groups that I held at the vet centers, and we had Vietnam era, we had Gulf War, we had Afghan, we had Iraq, and they would always talk about if it went to that route. We try to stay very topical, but when they started talking about their experiences, I came to this conclusion, and this is throughout history in war and combat in general. The weapons may be different, the uniforms may be different, the locations and the era could be different, but all humans had the same experiences right from the beginning of when man started doing combat or engaging in it up to today, in terms of how they react to that scenario, that situation. PTSD, to say, and really quickly, has always existed as long as man has existed to be in combat. So with that being said, combat, you're right. People, it obviously it affects a lot of people at one time. But at the same time, and this sounds a little strange, but bear with me, combat is very personal too. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is very, very personal. And let me explain why. Because while my buddy and I might be engaged in a firefight, it is me who might get killed, or he might get killed. But more importantly, that person is trying to kill me. And so it becomes very personalized, and a lot of people tend to forget. They think, and I think some of it has to do with the way the movies perceive war, and it's not very accurate, and they're trying, but it's not that great. But it's really it's very personal. I mean, when I think about it, I mean, there was somebody out there at night who was trying to kill me. I mean, how do you grapple with that, And some people are just kind of shrug it off, and some people are like, "Holy shit, this is a big deal." And so again, it comes down to each individual person, um, and even though that person out there who was deployed to a combat zone might not have been on the front lines, let's face it. One interesting fact that the Vietnam era veteran once told me, he said, "You folks have it really tough. When we were in Vietnam, we went to an R&R place, to like China Beach, or we went to a place where we knew we were safe. We can relax, and we didn't have to worry about getting bombed. For you folks, there is no safe place. There is no real green zone. You are always going to be at risk of getting blown up, no matter where you
Yeah.
are. There's no break from it. It's the constant um, engagement with the possibility of being killed." And then, Cross, I see what you coming there. Let me see what you got to say. Uh,
Yeah, this is something I'm definitely going to be weighing in on.
well, why don't you go ahead and read it and start? Kick it off.
Okay, so our question is, what about delayed symptoms? How often is it for military personnel to feel fine when they're in the situations, only to have PTSD manifest itself 5 years down the line or down the road when they're back home? So this is a thing that is the same with all trauma. This is I mean, I don't want to say all trauma, but it's a common thing that can happen in trauma in general. And when we're talking about delayed symptoms, a lot of times it's because when you're in the situation, you can't
Mm-hmm.
deal with it.
Yes.
You can't, you're in a fight or flight situation. The same is true in combat as well as in a abuse situation. So in both those situations, typically a child at the age of 7, 8, or 9 who is experiencing abuse, maybe for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they're not going to be, they might be experiencing symptoms of trauma, but they're not going to be experiencing PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
Because first off, PTSD is, as we said earlier, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. It's when the trauma is over. That is a
Yep.
very important factor
Yep.
in PTSD that we're going to be going into next week, very specifically dealing with PTSD itself, but it's the post response. While you're in the trauma, while you're experiencing the trauma, your body is in a fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
You're not experiencing all the emotional repercussions that's going to come with it because it's not safe to.
Mm-hmm.
We earlier this week, or I think actually yesterday, I posted Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yes.
which
Yes.
focuses more on where you are at as far as, are you having your physiological needs met? Are you having your emotional needs met? Are you having your personal, more self actualizations needs met? And so there's a hierarchy where if you are not safe, if you do not have those base needs of like physiological needs, food, safety, shelter, um, all of those sorts of very base needs,
Mm-hmm.
you're not able to deal with any higher level of need. This is the same thing. So when you're dealing with trauma while you're in the traumatic situation, all of your energy is being spent towards dealing with the trauma you're currently experiencing because you're just trying to survive.
You're right. There you go.
Now, after you're out of it, maybe it can take 5 years, as your example said, because maybe it takes you 5 years to get down to the position where you feel safe. Maybe you have blocked out memory.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in order to deal with the trauma you are experiencing, you had to compartmentalize to such a level that you actually aren't able to feel those emotions right away.
Mm-hmm.
It might take a while, and it might take a triggering event. You might be fine until something triggers you and you go, oh God, that just made me remember everything I went
Mm-hmm.
through back then. And so that's one of the things that PTSD is so interesting. And like I said, we're going to get so much more in depth. So
Yeah.
if this is a thing you want to talk about, please come back next stream. We're going to be
Oh
really going in
yes.
depth on that.
Yes. And going back to the trauma part, and Cross, thank you for the question. And Luke, you're kind of like on the same page as what we're talking about. Um, think about in this case, Cross, when someone is deployed to a combat area, they're exposed to a traumatic event, and let's say it is an isolated one. It only happened once, and they're still in that combat zone for another 8, maybe 10 months, and more than likely they're not going to process what happened because they're on that constant edge that this might happen again. And
Yeah.
then on the flip side, what if that person is being exposed to different trauma once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week? Depending on where you're at, it is very possible that you're getting exposed to trauma a lot. And then you have all of that stuff just sitting there on the back burner while you're trying to get through this deployment, and then you get home feeling like you're in a safe environment, and then all of that stuff comes rushing right back. That is basically the nuts and bolts of it, of how trauma can be delayed.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully across that gets you the answer you need for now. We want to keep you hooked so you show up next week, our next session.
Absolutely. And so then, we had the combat, but we also have disaster and natural disasters and combat zones in general. And you bring up a point with this is that, you could be experiencing different types of trauma based on day to day, week to week. And so people who are maybe living in those combat zones or those disaster zones, they're experiencing different things. A island that maybe has been hit by a tidal wave,
Mm-hmm.
let's say. Well, there's the initial response of there's a tidal wave. I mean, that right there you go.
Mm-hmm.
You're in one sort of trauma that you're already dealing with. And then as you're going through, maybe the weeks, months later, you're finding out the people that you loved who died.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're kind of experiencing a different level of this.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on, you're now all of a sudden dealing with a rebuilding
Yep.
era of maybe there's no food. Maybe you're going through starvation. Maybe you're having to watch your children die of malnutrition because there's not food for them to eat. Maybe you're having to sacrifice yourself in order to give them food. So these are things that when we're dealing with, and the reason that I put all of these together, the reason I put combat, disaster zones, and natural disasters into one area is because of that process. it's not a single process, such as with
Car
our car
crash.
accidents or our sexual assaults. They are hitting you on multiple different levels in multiple different ways, but at the same time you're also dealing with a community. You're involved in a community who is all also going through that,
Mm-hmm.
and that has its own challenges. There are situations where you're not, who do you go to? You're right now processing, you're taking care, you got to take care of yourself, but then what does that mean? What is that going to mean later on for things like survivor's guilt, which is something we've talked about before, of saying, why did I make it and they didn't?
Right.
Why do I have my house? Talking about last time we talked about the fires in Santa
Oh
Rosa, what, two
yes.
years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Why does one person have their house and the other person doesn't? Where at the same time they're all experiencing the trauma, they were all experiencing the fear of getting out, they're
Mm-hmm.
all experiencing the fear of losing people. But you also, this is an interesting thing, and the reason I want to put these into their own area, there's an interesting dynamic that happens of who has it worse.
Right.
Well, you didn't lose your house, you just lost all of your pets. Okay, well, I lost all my pets. That's a traumatic thing to me. And so we're dealing with it on different levels. And this is again where we come back to our definition of trauma, is it exceeds your ability to cope.
Mm-hmm.
And to one person, losing their entire house may be the equivalent of losing their one pet.
Yes.
They're all on an equal level, and the same thing goes for combat zones. Um, what
Yeah.
you experienced is may not be the same as what another person experienced, but it doesn't mean it wasn't still traumatic for them.
And Luke is really jumping in on that one too. He's kind of nailed it. It's wrong to look at it at different levels because it's individual. It's very personalized when it comes to traumatic events. And your typing is about as good as mine, man. So don't even worry about it. Let's go back to the fire. Something that was really interesting. I was there. I was. If you missed our last stream, I was there when Santa Rosa pretty much was all engulfed in flames. And when we were evacuating, it was really, it wasn't to me. I'm gonna be honest with you, it really wasn't that traumatic for me because I went to war, so it's a little bit different. But I started seeing some really sad things, and basically, okay, so it was really windy, and that's what made this fire really terrible. And I remember seeing embers coming in and landing on my house and landing on my driveway. And I saw this little kid's book, or what was left of it, the pages, and it was all singed around the edges and stuff like that. And I was like, damn, some kid has just lost their entire house, all their rooms, or their room, all their toys, all their books. I said that really sucks, and so I felt sad. I didn't feel traumatic or traumatized. I felt sad for what was happening to my community while we were driving this mass exodus out of the city. It was very, very.
Mhm.
It was an interesting perspective for me.
And then we also talked about last week, just bringing back the fires because this does have something uh, that still connects. Is that I had lived in Santa Rosa,
That's
and
right.
I actually the home I was living in up there burned down. I had to watch it from San Diego. However, I had been in San Diego for all the fires we've had before that. San Diego, for anybody who is from here, you know that we've had several of the worst fire. We call them firestorms at this point. So it's a firestorm, and it's a normal thing. We've had over the last probably 10 years. We've had three of the worst in history have been literally outside my window.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my families have lost their houses. It's kind of a normal thing here, unfortunately, but it's not something that's ever really impacted me directly. And then after watching the Santa Rosa fires and then living in an area that is so prone to fires, I actually started having my own secondary and vicarious trauma. Again, we'll be going into a very specific stream dedicated to this topic. I don't even know if we'll do it directly behind PTSD. We might need a break, but we'll see where we're going after that. We're taking it everything's one stream at a time. We have this stream in our next planned. After that, we're kind of going, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't know how this is going to affect us, having been survivors of PTSD as well. But yeah, that vicarious trauma of just dealing with that and dealing with the sadness of watching my family go through things, and because it's a community, and even if you having been part of that community, even though I'm not there anymore, it affects you differently. And so I was dealing with actually vicarious trauma. I was dealing with secondhand trauma, and you can ask my husband. I was waking up at night, full nightmares. I'm walking around the house taking pictures of things that I would need for insurance purposes if our house burned down. I was keeping bags packed. I didn't want to leave the house because all I could think is, what if I left the house, a fire breaks out, and I can't save my cats? I'm having nightmares about having to run out and not being able to take my cats, and having to, I mean, I'm actually hearing them meow like they're in a fire and dying. Like it was, I'm not talking like, oh, it's just like a little nightmare. Like this was like traumatizing to me.
Mm-hmm.
I was so upset over it. I was actually having trauma symptoms, even though I was not anywhere near a fire, just because where I was at was in a high risk zone at that time. And I was witnessing it so much. And so when we're dealing with disasters, when we're dealing with natural disasters, combat zones, when we're dealing with combat, you have to realize that based on where you're living, you can start having some of these fears that are starting to creep in. Now, I don't really fear a roadside bomb. I don't. I live in San Diego. Not to say that violence and bad things don't happen here, but I don't live in a country that is currently at war. I've
Mm-hmm.
never experienced war on my soil in my life. It's not something I can relate to. However, I can relate to fire. And so when we're dealing with combat zones, when we're dealing with disaster zones, when we're dealing with natural disasters, there was actually just a series of, it's a really bad tornado, and oh my gosh, I should have looked this up beforehand. Because my
Mm-hmm.
sister texted me and she goes, "Oh, by the way, Ruth is okay," and I went, "Wait, what?" I have
Mm-hmm.
no clue what you're talking about. No, he was in the tornado, and I'm like, "There was a tornado?" I had no clue.
Uh-huh.
So even in our country, we're dealing with other things. There's people right now that are being affected by mass tornadoes.
Mm-hmm.
There's people on the East Coast that I believe it was last year, they had a horrible hurricane. Obviously, we have things like Hurricane Katrina
Yes.
that happened down in the Louisiana and the Gulf Coast years ago. And I've been to Louisiana, I've seen the flood lines, and I've seen all that stuff. These are things that it doesn't always have to be combat, it doesn't always have to be any sort of disaster. Sometimes natural disasters can be traumatizing.
Mm-hmm.
There's just as much death, there's just as much destruction, there's an aftermath, and there are things that there's no control over. We can't
Right.
control a hurricane, we can't control a tornado. And so there's this sense of hopelessness, and I think that's something that's important with trauma, that people are also missing. There's this element of hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
We can't change it. There's nothing you can do to get out of it. If that tornado is coming, you can't just reroute that tornado. So when we're talking about things like abuse, and we're talking about sexual assault, these are things that happen to you,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of times that are not preventable.
And
um, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, and just to jump in there, and we talked about how the trauma it affects different ways and stuff like that. And something that just popped up in my mind was, what is the opposite of that? And that's security. When you're in America, you feel secure for the most part. You feel secure when you're driving down the highway or down a street because you're not really worried about a roadside bomb, or you're not worried about necessarily a tsunami, because we have early warning systems and stuff like that to keep us secure. And
Mhm.
so, what I pose for everybody who's watching in the audience, as far as this goes, is this: what does that mean as far as security, and how important is it for us as humans to have that? And what happens when we have that sense of security taken away?
Absolutely. I feel that's actually a good segue into, unless you have more you would like to talk about with
No.
combat, because I want to make sure we have time at the end to talk about symptoms and some support tactics. So I want to jump into abuse. And yeah, I'm not shy about the fact that I am a survivor of childhood abuse. I don't. I don't keep that part of myself hidden because of the taboo. And I know it makes people uncomfortable when I say that. And I'm sorry, I don't care.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess I don't because I don't. It needs to not be taboo. And the reason that this is such a passion project of mine with specifically dealing with trauma is a lot of times when you're children, you don't you don't have that control, just like we were saying, you don't have that control, you don't have that safety. And this is something that is happening in very important years. This is something that's happening during very developmental stages of your life,
Mm-hmm.
and where you're supposed to be having these people who are supposed to be protecting you and keeping you safe, and yet they're the ones who are actually causing you physical harm. So there is, first I want to make sure, just I'm going to do a little bit of abuse education here, because it's important to understand that if you are seeing these things, you need to get this person help. I was personally a victim of child abuse starting from literally birth. There is abuse that went back all the way to my actual birth, and lasted all the way until I was 17 before I was actually taken away from my mother by Child Protective Services. So I dealt with 17 years of abuse before I got out, and most of my abuse was related to neglect, emotional abuse, and physical abuse. I'm very lucky. I never experienced sexual abuse. Um, I have experienced sexual trauma in my life, but not sexual abuse. There's a difference. Um, and so I think that it's important that people understand that there's different levels of abuse, there's different areas of
Mm-hmm.
abuse. They're all equal. They can all have traumatizing effects. So the first one is that everybody recognizes is physical abuse. We all know that it is not right to physically harm your child. We all get that.
Mm-hmm.
So physical abuse is anything that is obviously a physical act of violence towards a child that exceeds the level of reasonable punishment. For instance, I have a little sister. My little sister is the kind of kid that if you say don't touch the stove, she had to touch it. She just
Yep.
had to. It was There
Mm-hmm.
was no choice in her mind but to touch the stove. Um, and so at that point, like she would just get blinders on. She couldn't hear you as you're saying, Shikai, don't touch it, Shikai, don't touch it, Shikai, don't touch it. She not there. So, I'm not gonna lie. Sometimes a little like tap on the booty, not hard, but like a little, hey,
Yeah.
oh, what are you saying? Don't touch the stove. Something like that might be something. I'm not gonna sit here and condone spanking. And I'm not gonna sit here and enforce it either. That's between you and what you want to do. There's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of stuff that says there's plenty of other ways to discipline a child that even is beyond spanking, but that's not a debate to have right now. But there's a reasonable force that you can have when the force is happening to such an extent that it is leaving a mark,
Mm-hmm.
when it is leaving long-standing injury. Those are things that constitute as physical abuse. So that's the first one. So obviously, if you're looking for signs of that, you're looking for frequent injuries, you're looking for abnormal dress in clothing, a child who in the middle of summer, like me, who hates the heat. And I will frequently tell you how much I hate the heat, but I'm wearing sweatshirts in the middle of June and July to cover up bruises. Those are sorts of things that you would want to look for as an adult who is maybe has children, who have friends. That's what you're going to be looking for with physical abuse. With emotional abuse is the second one, which I see that we have Luke has commented with emotional abuse can be just as bad as physical abuse, and people don't see that. So yeah, we're going to talk about emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is all those things that it goes over and above, and sometimes it can be just as traumatizing, and people don't realize that. The only example I have of emotional abuse, and I know I'm going to make people uncomfortable sharing this, but again, I don't care, is that growing up, my father and my stepmother were very much aware of the abuse I was receiving from my birth mother. However, my stepmother would actually tell me that I deserved it and that I was a bad child and I should be hit. That's emotional abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Right there. That
Pretty
is
good.
emotional
Pretty good
abuse.
example.
That's a really good example. Another example of emotional abuse would be a parent that may be constantly threatens suicide. If I commit suicide, it's your fault.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I hurt myself, it's your fault. Those sorts of things can be emotional abuse. It's You're dealing with things that are manipulation. You're dealing with things that are putting blame or some sort of emotional um, responsibility onto a child that they don't need to have.
Right.
It's belittling to the point where you are purposely doing it as a way to make them feel bad about themselves, telling them they're stupid, telling them they're ugly. Um, I mean, siblings will sometimes will razz each other and go, "Oh my gosh, you're like the ugliest kid ever. Who would date you?" That's siblings.
Yeah.
Siblings, we say that stuff. But it's different if it is with a very malicious intent. Unfortunately, does matter with this. If
Absolutely.
you're looking for signs of emotional abuse, a lot of times you see it. A lot of times you might be around a parent who will convey these messages to a child. You might be looking for things like extreme depression and words of self-hate. I deserve this. I'm just
Mm-hmm.
a bad kid.
Mm-hmm.
I don't deserve to have nice things. I'm just stupid. Those are some things you can hear and see with children. Again, all my education is for the parents out there who have children, or for educators. Please, educators, learn this. These are things that you can pick up and start to suspect
Yes.
that there's some sort of emotional abuse. And so then I'm going to go back to our and no problem, Luke. You said that he was a little ahead of himself, but
Oh,
yeah, that's
yeah,
fine.
yeah.
I'm going in order here, so that's totally fine. So many cultures have this insane notion about talking about your abuse mental issues. It is as a very bad thing, and seeking help is only for the weak. Yeah, this is something we talked about, and that's something we're going to talk about after we finish talking about abuse. Is the support aspect of dealing with it, and then we also had. I want to make sure that this is uh, I appreciate you sharing this. That's not something I'm going to read online just for your own personal privacy. It's a personal story of something that dealing with talking with her mom about different situations.
Mm.
And then Luke also has come back with that's really common in relationships with a partner. No offense, has mental problems like the borderline, and that will change the behavior of the partner too. That's often a lost side. Yeah.
Yes.
We're with abuse. This is not something that is just in childhood. The only reason I advocate for childhood is because this is something that parents miss when they are with their friends as children. Because a child, although an abuse victim does not always feel comfortable saying, "Hey, I'm being abused."
Mm-hmm.
That's a tends to be a very typical response, is to not talk about being abused because it's embarrassing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's taboo. Um, but there's a very specific with talking about child abuse of just making sure people around are recognizing. Obviously, all of this applies to your friends. If you are seeing a friend who is frequently being injured, then yes, it's a good idea to maybe talk to them about whether or not they are safe at home with their partner. If you're talking to somebody who is a friend and their vocabulary starts to change once they're in a different relationship about how much they are horrible and how much they deserve to be treated badly.
Mm-hmm.
You might be also looking at somebody who's being emotionally abused as an adult. So
Yeah. There's a lot
very,
of signs
very
for
good
that.
things to remember.
Yep.
Very good things to remember that doesn't always apply to kids. Did you want to
Well,
chime in before we
yeah, I
move
was
on
just going to
to?
jump in real quick with partners. A lot of folks, you know, you nailed it there as far as the way they perceive themselves and how it's changed
Mhm.
in a more of a negative light. And also things to take a look at is the fact that a lot of the times I see this happen with clients and with what I've read, where the person who's being subjected to this emotional or physical abuse will often start cutting off contact to maybe at first their friends. and then
Mhm.
it goes to family members, and then they're completely cut off from everybody, just because of what's going on in their relationships and the abuse and the trauma. And those are other ways to look at, or markers, red flags. You know, we always joke about how when someone gets in a relationship, they kind of blow off their friends. Well, that's different. Let's not get those two confused. It's more like when that person, there's more markers in terms of what to look for, and that was all I was gonna say.
No, absolutely, and that's the same with children too. Is they experience, and I was going to get into all the ones that are the symptoms of all
Mm-hmm.
the abuse. These are just ones that are conducive to very specific types of
Mm-hmm.
abuse. And in the end, I'm going to go through the common symptoms of all abuse. So it's my process.
Sure, sure.
um, so yeah. So moving on is that so we've had physical abuse. We're dealing with physical symptoms. We're dealing with emotional abuse. It's kind of more that emotional side. Sexual abuse is also one of those ones that is more recognized, that people tend to recognize a little bit more easily as being abuse.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this is anything. This can be anything that is molestation, anything that is performing actual acts of in a sexual nature with a underage minor. Definitely when it is, and this is where it gets confusing. Is a lot of times um, the reason it, and I'm going to try to address this topic very respectfully, because it is a situation can that become very triggering, especially to anybody in our audience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the problem with sexual abuse and its recognition of of finding out what's going on with a child is because, let's just be honest, sex is pleasant. Um, it's typically a very physically gratifying situation, and so it can be very confusing because a younger child may not necessarily, because they don't understand what's going on and they just know it feels good. It can be very confusing of, well, this person loves me, this person cares about me,
Mm-hmm.
this person is doing something that feels good with me, and that can be a very confusing thing for a child to deal with. And it doesn't change the fact that it's still abuse.
Yep.
And it's there's no consent. Even if a child quote unquote consents, a child is not capable of consenting because they
Mm-hmm.
do not fully understand what is going on. And so when you're dealing with sexual abuse, you're not only dealing with anything that's like physical act, but you're dealing with anything that is exposure to inappropriate sexual experiences with a child, as well as anything that's exploitation.
Yes.
If this is dealing with, yes, there's the extreme side of it of actual sex trafficking, that is obviously sexual exploitation,
Mm-hmm.
but it can also be anything like taking photographs
Yeah.
of an inappropriate nature, or coercing this person to do something that maybe they are not mature enough to be able to do or to handle emotionally.
Or they get
So
blackmailed. They get blackmailed into doing
yeah.
it.
Oh
I've
yeah, a
seen
lot
that
of times
happen
there's
many
blackmail.
times. This says, if you
Absolutely.
don't send me these pictures of yourself and revealing poses, I'm gonna tell all your friends, or they're gonna do something. And you know, I don't have it, but like Snapchat, or even through other medias of ways of getting persons or people to do this. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Oh.
You cut out for a second, getting people to, and then I lost you.
Basically, just getting people to, um, get manipulated into doing this.
Oh yeah, manipulation. You
Hmm.
that's the word right there. Is, it's a manipulation tactic. And so if you're
Hmm.
dealing with these sorts of situations, this is not as common in adult relationships as far as abuse. However, we did address earlier that spousal rape is an actual thing.
Yes.
Sex still needs to be consensual.
Hmm.
Both parties still need to be okay with what's going on. Just because one is comfortable with multiple partners, or with a BDSM situation, or with whatever it is, doesn't mean the other person is comfortable with it.
Hmm.
Those things can be very traumatizing. They can be very abusive if it is being forced upon a partner that is not willing.
Right.
Um, but you don't tend to see the same symptoms as you do with children because children literally do not understand what is actually happening to them. So with children who are being sexual abused, you will typically notice higher sexualization of a child.
Mm-hmm.
They will be more interested in sexual things. They will talk about it. They will point it out. They will express it more. You will see a lot more with much younger children, more touching of themselves. You also will usually see, especially in situations like that, you might find bruising or injury within more of the genital region.
Right.
Um, Frequent injury, stuff like that. Fear of an individual, not wanting to be around that person, but mostly that more outward expression of sexual feelings and sexual acts will be noticed, especially in very, very young children.
Mm-hmm.
In more teenage years, you just might see somebody who's more hypersexualized. And so those are some things too. If again, you're a parent out there, you have children, they have friends, you start to be concerned about anything, these are the sorts of things you want to be looking out for.
Yes.
And then finally, because I do want to make sure we leave a good amount of time at the end to
Mm-hmm.
talk about additional symptoms and support and things like that. This is one of those topics of abuse that is frequently overlooked, and
Mm-hmm.
that is neglect.
Yes. Very important.
Neglect, yeah, right? Neglect is a situation where a person or a child is not having those basic needs met. So when we're talking about, again, to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Yep.
when you are having a child that is not having basic needs met, this includes physical safety. This includes not having being nourished or being clothed properly or having proper medical care or
Yep.
given proper education. Those are all situations of neglect. A child who is experiencing neglect is likely going to have symptoms such as frequent absences from school.
Mm-hmm.
They are going to be experiencing higher than normal levels of illness. They're going to be constantly hungry. And this doesn't mean that if you have a child or a teenager and they bring over their teenager friends and they, eat you out of house and home, that's normal.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Teenagers will just ransack your
Oh
your
God, yes.
refrigerator, and that's just what it is. We're talking about a child that is constantly doesn't have lunch, a child who again is constantly absent from school, who is frequently ill, who is getting injuries. They don't necessarily have to be physical abuse, but is this child in a situation where they're being protected, even from just the element?
Mm-hmm.
A good example, again, I use myself, is growing up, I had no supervision. Let's just be honest, I had none. My father and his girlfriend at the time were actually drug dealers. Again, I'm not shy about my past, and so I had no supervision. So this could result in frequent injuries because I was at 4 or 5 years old, allowed to just walk around the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that is a form of neglect.
Yes.
There is no supervision, having exposure to potentially very harmful situations. So things like that. So if you have a child with a friend, frequent injuries, always sick, always hungry, uh, talking about maybe not having a roof over their head, maybe talking about not having clean water
Mm-hmm.
or food. Those are some things you can kind of look for and say, hey, I think there might be something up. And I know that because I don't want to do a whole segment on child abuse, even though I'm sure we could, I don't want to, at least not now.
Mm-hmm.
But I just want to make sure everybody understands that there are places to report. I will be putting up a link of Child Welfare Services, CWS. If you suspect anything, you can actually call them up and ask, hey, is this something I can report? Is this
Yeah.
something that I can, that is important for me to maybe to point out to the authorities? and they'll let you
Mhm.
know. They're really nice. I've had to call for client situations in the past many, 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 many times, unfortunately. And some of those times were actually reportable, and there were actually times that it wasn't. They're like, well, this doesn't really. No, you need to follow up with these different agencies instead. So they'll tell you exactly what you need to do.
And one thing I want to,
They're
what
very nice.
I wouldn't mind jumping in there because you were talking about some of the warnings. What about hygiene? Would hygiene be like
Thank you.
does a
Yes,
kid coming in?
hygiene.
Yeah.
Neglect, that's a definite. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I
Hmm.
did not write it on my pretty little list over to the side here. Yeah, if they're clothes that don't fit, ill-fitting clothes is usually a very good sign. It doesn't necessarily have to be dirty or ripped or something like that. Sometimes parents prefer to send them to school in something that, has a little hole in it because they know that they're going to be rough and tumble. They don't want to mess up their nice clothes that they wear to like church and stuff like that.
Hmm.
However, if it's frequent, if it doesn't fit well, if it has many stains or is obviously just not being well kept, a child who doesn't know how to brush their teeth, may not have access to a toothbrush at home. That's
Hmm.
something that most of us take for granted. I also experienced homelessness as a child, so I do speak some from experience of this, of not having places to take a shower. Um, and that kind of goes back to that frequent illness as well.
Yes,
We all
absolutely.
love running in the mud, but if you're constantly dirty, you are actually exposing yourselves to more germs
Hmm.
and experiencing frequent sickness and an injury. So yeah, absolutely. And then as far as like our overall symptoms that you can kind of look for in pretty much all trauma. This actually goes for all trauma. Now, obviously, if somebody just experienced a natural disaster or just came back from combat, yes, you're kind of already aware that they may have experienced trauma. But in some of those situations that maybe are not so obvious, such as maybe a spousal abuse, maybe a sexual assault situation,
Hmm.
maybe a different sort of thing like a child abuse case, the way that you're going to look for information about whether or not there could be a problem is behavior.
Hmm.
Behavior is a huge sign for a potential trauma. So we already mentioned this a little bit in the past, but behavior changes.
Yes.
When somebody is usually super nice and all of a sudden they're aggressive, all of a sudden they're very moody, they're very snappy. Somebody who is suddenly always talking about how, like, oh my gosh, I know, like, I'm just so cool. And then they get in a new relationship and it's, I'm just not very good. I wish I was better at this. I wish I didn't suck so much at that.
Hmm.
Those frequent injuries, obviously, signs of depression, signs of anxiety, as well as things like avoidance.
Yes. Oh boy.
And avoidance, I'm gonna let you talk about avoidance because my mouth is dry from talking so much.
All right. Well, thank you. Um, Avoidance. Where can we
You're
start?
welcome.
Well, let's go back to the highway scenario. That's one good example that I saw a lot with the veterans I was serving. Um, they hated being on the highway, and it wasn't so much the highway itself, but um, the particular stretch of highway that when I say we, I'm talking about people in Santa Rosa would drive on is Highway 101. And Highway 101 is almost always littered with trash. And some of these vets that I was seeing, they would associate that trash with a possible bomb, a roadside bomb. So they would completely avoid being on the highway and they would just take the side roads. Now, that's one very specific example, but it could be different things too. Sights. If something it visually reminds them of the traumatic event, and they purposely avoid it, that would be another example. It could also be smells. You know, I remember for my own personal example, when I was living in South Dakota, whenever I had to drive to my home, I would cross this one part of the road for whatever reason. It always smelled like the sewers, and I'm talking some
Mm.
rank, stank, looking, smelling, really nasty odor. And it would always, not always, but it would kind of bring me back to when I was in Iraq, because that place at the time it stunk. I mean, there was, I don't know if it was the sewers or the raw sewage out there, but and so if I wanted to avoid it, I would have to take a completely different route so I wouldn't have to smell that again. And so basically, avoidance is, it can affect all the senses. It could even be
Yeah.
something that you hear.
Mhm.
I'll give you another great example. We talked about fireworks, and obviously, a lot of people avoid Fourth of July because of the associations of that trauma. Something that I talked about in our last stream was um, when they had the North Bay fires, when Santa Rosa was on fire. A lot of choppers were flying overhead, dropping off goods,
Mhm.
evacuating people, and I had a lot of Vietnam era veterans who were saying that these choppers were bringing them back to Vietnam because some of these choppers, these helicopters, were the Hueys, and that was what
Mhm.
was used in Vietnam when it came to evacuating people or dropping people into the jungle, and so it was totally just bringing them back, and they were trying to avoid, the sound of the Huey makes a very specific sound that's distinctive for many folks, and so they were trying to avoid hearing it, and so that is just another way that the brain is trying to um, protect it, the body, protect the mind, so that they don't refocus or re-traumatize themselves on what was going on. So let
Yeah,
me,
Luke said something really important. He said, or even time, a scene of lightning or seasons. And
yeah,
that is another thing that's so important with triggering moments in avoidance is what can the time of year, sometimes the time of year. And obviously we can't avoid that though, can we?
right,
We would love to, I would love to just completely skip the entire end of April, early May. And this is something I've talked about on other streams, is that it is a very triggering time of year for me because when I was actually taken by Child Protective Services, it was followed by a particularly difficult situation, a particularly violent experience I had that occurred in late April, and yeah, it can be very triggering
mm-hmm.
to remember those times of the year, because I had to actually go to my prom with a lot of bruises covered up, and I was in a walking boot and I had a wrist brace on, and I like took off the wrist brace and stuff like that, and my boyfriend at the time, who is actually now my husband for the record, cute little love story there. But my boyfriend at the time, John, awesome, love you, baby. He's actually in our photos for our prom. He's actually helping hold me up because I had been on crutches. And so prom can be a triggering thing for me. I have walked into restaurants where, oh, it's early May or it's late April. It's prom season. There's a bunch of girls in
Oh
dresses.
yes.
And my husband is so smart. He goes, I guess we're going somewhere else. And
Yeah,
we'll turn around and we'll leave because
good
he
man.
knows that, yeah, no, I'm a great guy. He knows all about it. Or there's a song by Disturbed, Down with the Sickness,
Mm.
or just Sickness. I'm blanking now. Wow, how sad is that? But in the unedited version, the ending is very triggering. Anybody who's ever heard that song knows
Oh
what I'm
yes.
talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I love them. I absolutely love that band, but most of my friends and family know if they're playing that song. My little sister, my brother-in-law was playing it the other day on our way to the zoo, and my sister just politely leans over to him and goes, "You need to skip this before it gets to the end." And he goes, "Okay." And I caught it, and I
Mm-hmm.
knew exactly what she was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, they skipped it at the end, and she just kind of gave me this little like, "I gotcha, sis,"
There
because
you
they know
go.
that song, because those those sounds. I'm trying not to get actually triggered by it. Those sounds of that song are actually one of the few things that still to this day will actually full out trigger me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I will be crying. I'll have full out flashbacks. It's a very traumatizing thing. Again, if you've heard that song, you know
Yeah,
exactly what
you know
I'm
what we're
talking
talking about.
about.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard that song, I highly recommend you do not listen to it if you've ever experienced child abuse.
Yes.
If you have no relation to abuse and you really want to know what I'm talking about, take the risk, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
But if you specifically have ever experienced a sort of abuse, please do not listen to that song just to know what I'm talking about.
And we're
That's my
definitely not going
disclaimer.
to link it either.
We are definitely not going to link it. And again, I'm not going to lie, I've been to like 3 of their concerts.
Mm-hmm.
But their concert version doesn't have it.
Oh.
So I'm fine. I mean, it's hard to recreate. So it's fine. By the way, that's the kind of music I listen to. In case anyone was ever wondering, Disturbed, 3 Days Grace, Avenged Sevenfold. That's my groove. So yeah, those are all things. we're getting all rock and roll up in here. Remind me to tell you about the Metallica concert I went to later.
Uh-oh.
So triggers, those are all triggers. And so the reason it's important to talk about avoidance when we're talking about trauma is because when we're talking about avoidance, typically reason we're avoiding things is because of the triggers that they lead to.
Mm-hmm. Right, and again, it goes back down to your brain. Your mind is trying to preserve you as a whole. It's saying let's not go down this particular street because it's very reminiscent of when you were assaulted. So we're going to go and walk an extra 5 or 6 blocks just to avoid going through this shortcut, and it's trying to prevent you from not just re-experiencing the trauma, but also future potential trauma. So you now associate this particular strip of road as being a place where could be a high probability of being assaulted. And so the brain says, nope, no, 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 nope, let's get out of that way. Let's get out of harm's way. Let's go this way and just avoid that street altogether. And so again,
Absolutely.
just another example. So we've got about 15 minutes left. We want to make sure we have enough time.
Yeah, I want to make sure I was just about to say that with the last 15 minutes, I thought it was maybe good to change gears, and because we're going to be doing PTSD next stream, and we're going to be mostly getting into like more of the nitty gritty of the aftermath of trauma. For the record, some of the things we're going to be talking about, for those who want to know, I'll be also putting this up on the website or on the Facebook website. I should say just Facebook website because we don't have a real website. Is I want to make sure that that's our Twitter. Make sure we get our Facebook.
Oh yeah,
up there
I'm working on it.
Okay, just making sure because that's the one that I'm going to put this information. I'm not going to put this on Twitter. We're going to be talking about things such as, wow, completely lost my train of thought. It seems to always happen about this time. We're going to be talking about PTSD, obviously. We're going to be talking about some of the long-term effects of trauma, as well as some of the more short-term. We've talked some about the short-term this time, but we're going to be going more specifically into the actual short-term, long-term effects of trauma, therapy methods that are available for people who have gone through trauma, as well as different disorders outside of PTSD that you might be experiencing. But for this one, because of the fact we only have 15 minutes, and I want to make sure that those who are out there are getting some sort of support for some of the very triggering topics that we have talked about, is I want to make sure that we are talking about what people can do who are supporting those who are going through trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if you have anything to say or if you're still putting in links.
No, I think I got all the links. No, go ahead, take it away.
So I think that just what I want to make sure going into the last 10-15 minutes is, so people that are going through trauma, one of the important things is talk about it. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I've experienced these things. People who are then hearing this, those of the support systems that you have, just remember that they're going through something.
Mm-hmm.
Don't blame them if they do something like wanting to avoid. I've had friends who have in the past not understand. I did have somebody who said that they can understand issues with that song. But I've had friends that don't understand. They're like, but it's such a kick-ass song.
Yeah.
Just listen to it. It's so cool. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but you didn't go through this.
Mm-hmm.
So this is very triggering. And they don't, well, it's been a long time. You went through that as a kid. How is it still affecting you now? Well, the thing is that it doesn't ever stop affecting you. Mm-hmm. When you've been through trauma, it is now part of you. And that is something that I think that trauma survivors, when they go to therapy, they sometimes just want it to go away. They want a magical pill that just makes it you forget. But the reality is that when you've experienced trauma, you've always been a person that's experienced trauma. I am right now, I never say victim. I've always changed, I changed my words. I don't say I'm a victim of child abuse. I always say I'm a survivor of child abuse. But that is who I am, and that's not going to ever change. There's nothing that's ever going to happen in my life that is going to make it so I didn't experience child abuse. Nothing. That's just the rest of my life I will be a person that deals with child abuse. However, how I deal with that, and that's something we've talked about with resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt, I'm gonna actually, I don't think you've ever read my blog. I actually have a blog on resilience.
Oh, I'll have to check it out.
Yeah,
Thank you.
it's going to be a multiple part series that I'm planning on actually continuing this month. It starts out with my first blog. I'll post it up on our Facebook as well. It talks actually about, and these are real life examples, by the way. The example I give in the blog is about two girls. This is actually about me and another person that I grew up with, and the way that growing up, her and I have now experienced our trauma in different ways, even though we've been through very similar things.
Mm-hmm.
And so it talks about what makes up resiliency. So those are some things I'm going to be posting, some things we'll be talking about later. But the basic thing I want to make sure people understand is that if you've experienced trauma, it's fine. It's all good. You've experienced it. You are a survivor. You have done something that very few people have ever done, and you can move on, and you can actually be happy and healthy and well adjusted like me.
And me.
and Matt, yeah. So we are two examples of trauma survivors. We have combat related trauma, we have abuse related trauma, and we have both overcome our situations. Just because we've experienced it, I'm sure Matt will also agree that he will never have not been in combat. That's an experience he's always going to have.
Yep.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it has to define him, and it doesn't mean that it has to hold him back.
Absolutely.
So exactly. So the people that are supporting those of us who have been through trauma understand that we are happy you don't understand.
Right.
We're happy you don't have the experience we have. We are I am thrilled that my husband had never been physically assaulted by his mother. By the way, my mother-in-law is a fantastic woman. So I am thrilled beyond belief that my husband has never experienced that. I am thrilled that my sisters never had to endure that. They had my stepmom as a mom, so they had their own trials, but they never had to experience the physical abuse I went through. I am grateful that my best friend never had to experience it. And so that's the thing about survivors of trauma. We're happy you don't get it.
Yeah.
We really are.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But at the same time, understand and give us some grace because you don't understand.
Yep.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
No.
That's my soapbox.
No, that's fine. No, you there's nothing much more I can add to that other than just, understanding, just being a little understanding and listen to them. Everybody has a struggle, or everybody has their own personal struggles. However, when you are talking to someone who's a survivor, you don't necessarily have to psychoanalyze why they are doing this, why they are avoiding it. Just accept that they're doing it for them to protect themselves.
Yeah, it's not a weakness. And I love that Luke's comment here. And it really helps to hear that other people are going through that too. That
Luke,
you're not alone with things. Today. I'm sorry?
Luke has been very awesome today. It's, across.
That's a great point. Is that as much as now, obviously, I do not advocate for people who have not processed their trauma to just go out and start talking about it because it can be triggering.
Mm-hmm.
The people who have maybe processed it, who have learned the coping skills necessary, the people like me and Matt, you don't have to be a therapist though, by the way. I have purposely taken my trauma and turned it into therapy for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Matt has started working with Stack Up and helping people through their issues with trauma for a reason. We have a reason. We turned our pain into our passion.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we did. Now, you don't have to be like us. You don't have to decide you're going to be a therapist. And you don't have to go out and start, public speaking. I actually do public speaking events on my story. I have had to stand up in front of a classroom full of freshmen and actually utter the words, "That's the day my mother tried to kill me." That is not something I recommend that everybody does.
Right.
However, for those who have gone through these things and who feel that they have processed their trauma and they are strong, talk about it. This is PTSD Awareness Month. Talk about it. Who are you? What have you survived? What makes you a survivor? One of the hashtags I see going around is support survivors. That's what we are. If you are a trauma survivor, you're a survivor. And using that story to make sure that people know that they're not alone is one of the ways we're going to see change within this topic.
Right.
We're going to make sure people understand it's not taboo.
Right.
We're going to make sure people understand that it's not something, oh, you put yourself in that position. Everybody who has experienced trauma has a right to be respected. Their feelings are valid. Just because maybe you went through something that was similar and you weren't traumatized, you're not that other person.
Right.
So just mutual respect is the one thing that I want to make sure that we come away from, is just making sure that we are loving, respecting, being there for each other, talking about our experiences, and spreading awareness of what trauma is. Next stream, we're going to be getting super in depth about the very specific areas of trauma, what the repercussions are, specific support tactics, specific areas that you can seek help with therapy, specific tools that those who are in our support systems can use to offer support and guidance through getting through it. But this one, we just really wanted to focus on what is trauma, what are the areas of trauma, and hoping we don't trigger anybody to
right.
that.
And like I said, I just put some links in there for Stack Up, of course, because Stack Up, we're streaming on their page. We're very thankful for this opportunity, but also I put a link there for the Stop program. It's a 24/7 peer-to-peer support group, well-trained staff. I am going to toot my own horn. I'm the the manager of the program. Thank you. Yeah, and I make sure that everybody who signs up and answers the call is well trained and prepared. And since we're starting to run into, we got about 6 minutes left, I want to personally thank the audience today. We did have a raid, and I didn't get a chance to acknowledge it, but I want to thank everybody who came out today, spent whatever free time you had, and we greatly appreciate that. And I'm very thankful for all this engagement that was going on. Very, very good stuff. This is why we're doing this. This is what gets me excited, when people are jumping in and expressing themselves and allowing us, the rest of the audience, and Hannah and I, to really get an idea of your perspective of these topics. And it's a beautiful thing. This is the stuff that we're trying to do to help break the stigmas of mental health and bring about mental health awareness. And that. Just keep your eye out. We'll be having more information coming up for our next stream. Keep an eye out for it. Click on those links that I provided and to get the latest scoop and the wonderful media that Hannah puts out, and the occasional screw ups that I try to do when it comes to putting out. We had a discussion.
It's confusing,
dude.
You're
all right,
good.
For everybody who's out there watching right now, I actually had to have she had to teach me how, when to use the hashtags and when to use the @ symbol, and I'm like, okay, well, it's a good thing we have this in writing so I can refer back to it when I'm starting to tag things and post, because I don't still quite get it, but I'm working on it.
Oh, he's doing fantastic. Don't say that. But I want to just say thank you to the audience, because this is not something, as much as I'm used to talking about the experience that I've had, and I'm not shy about the trauma I've experienced at all. It is not. This is the first time I've ever done it on camera, so I do appreciate everybody's support today
Mm-hmm.
and just the amount of feedback we're getting from people that say, hey, thanks for doing what you're doing and sharing what you're sharing.
Yes.
We can continue the conversation offline. Again, our Facebook, check out our Facebook and check out our Twitter. Most of our information goes on our Facebook as far as links, special things I like to put up. Twitter is just kind of more engagement with us. I will also be posting a special thing later today for our game code giveaway winner.
Yeah.
We'll be posting it later. I don't want to post it on here in voice just because the fact that we are probably going to be turning this into podcasts and stuff like that later, and I don't want to throw people out there. So that will be up on our Twitter within probably the next half an hour, as well as on our Facebook. And yeah, thank you guys for joining us, and tune in next time and get your friends. If this is something you like, I will be putting this episode up as soon as Matt gets me the video, and I'll be putting it up on my YouTube. So I do have a YouTube account. You can always subscribe to that for if you do miss episodes. Then if you subscribe to my channel, you can get notification when we put something else up, or you can always see it on our Facebook or our Twitter. I try to make sure all of I think I at this point have like 11 different social media based accounts that I'm managing at the moment. And I try to keep them all updated.
Too much for me.
Oh yeah, well between this and my own projects, I keep all of it integrated. So if you like what we do, check those out. We'll get the video up soon. We'll get our winner up soon. And we'll get whatever different links we have.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully between today and tomorrow, we'll have all of that up.
All right. Well, once again, everybody, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate your company and your time, and keep an eye out for us for our next stream. There you go. There we go. Waiting for that before I stop the stream. We'll see you guys later, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. See you later.